Welcome everyone. I'd like to welcome you to the final session of the day. And I'd like to introduce Brian DeConinck from North Carolina State University's Office of Information Technology. He's part of the design team who manages their WordPress installs for all of the academic and administrative units on campus. As part of his projects, he manages multi-site environments and advises clients as well. Please help us welcome Brian as he helps us. What? For me? No, for Brian. Help welcome Brian. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. So, since it is the last session of the day and you've all made it through a very long day, this is not going to be a very technical talk. This is not going to be a very intense talk. I'm just going to tell a story up here. And that's a little confusing because there's a storytelling session happening over there. This is not that session. This is a different session. This is just my story. And there's a lot that goes into this story. And I'm going to tell you up front, I'm not telling the full truth in this. I'm sort of fudging a few details here and there to make it easier to tell and to make us look a little bit better than we actually are. So if you feel outraged and angry about that, you can confront me afterwards, and I'm happy to tell you all the dirty secrets. I also want to make a quick comment about my employer, the NC State University Office of Information Technology. I just want to say that NC State is a great place to work, a really special place, and OIT is a really special place to work. And I'm going to air a little bit of dirty laundry over the course of this talk, and I want you all to know that that's coming from a place of love, because I really do appreciate where I work. It's not bitterness, I promise. Well, maybe a little bit of bitterness sometimes, but mostly it's love. So let's start off with the moral of the story, and I'm going to tell you this now so you have things to listen for as you watch the talk, and we're going to come back to this at the very end. The moral of our story today is that you should find ways to trust and empower your content creators. This is hopefully not too radical of an idea for any of you, but it's something I want you to keep in mind as we move forward. So let's start getting to know NC State a little bit. A lot of you are from big schools like us. A lot of you are from small schools and probably still have the same problems we have. NC State is big and decentralized. There's a lot going on. We have 12 colleges, and we have a lot of other things that are not colleges, but they may as well be colleges. They're sort of college level. Anything from the Office of Finance and Administration, which seems like it should be everything that happens on campus, to the Institute for Advanced Analytics, which is not a college, but it's a special institute that has master's programs, just all these different things. And at NC State, since we are big and decentralized, we do not have a campus-wide governance plan. We do not have any campus-wide mandates for where websites are hosted, what they should be built in, WordPress or some other CMS. We do have some brand guidelines that we're supposed to follow, but even that, people find ways around them. So the key thing here is that all of these different big high-level units are all responsible for their own web presence, and they're all responsible for hiring their own web team. And in higher ed, money is not always available, and that gets tight, and that gets difficult for some groups. And so that's where the group I work with comes in. We're part of the Central IT Office, the Office of Information Technology, and we're basically a web team for hire. If you can't afford to hire web developers, if you can't afford to hire the people who are responsible for your website, we'll do it for you. And we'll do it at a vastly discounted rate from what an outside vendor would do, because we don't want to bankrupt our own university. So we give a lot of stuff away for free. And so what we will do lots of things. We will build you custom theme, custom plugins. We will do usability testing for you. We'll help manage WordPress for you. We will do tier 2 and tier 3 web hosting support. We're going to do all these things for you. What we will not do is own your website. And that is a sort of a subtle distinction that I want to spend a little time on. It's not even a distinction that we've really explored verbally within our group. It's just sort of understood among us. Website ownership, to me, in this context, means that while we'll help run your website, you're still responsible for its content. We don't write copy. We don't decide what should be on your website, and we don't decide when your content needs to be updated. So if you wrote something in 2008 and you've decided that that was right in 2008 and it will always be right for the rest of time, we're not going to tell you you need to update that. That's on you. It's your website. You own it. So that's this ownership idea. And that's all the background you need to know about NC State. So let's talk now about what I call the distant past, or the whole of history before I was hired. So I was hired in November of 2014, and I started to learn about OIT's website, the website of the Office of Information Technology. And there's this question of ownership. Who owns the OIT website? And my answer in July of 2015, and that's sort of a turning point we'll get to in a little bit, was not me. I am not the owner. It is not my problem. And the reason why is because even though OIT Design is a web team inside of OIT, we aren't OIT's web team. We are not the owners of the OIT website because we don't get into that business. We don't decide when content needs to be updated. We don't touch that stuff. So who does own OIT, or the OIT website? Back in the distant past, by which I mean about 2008, OIT was formed from the consolidation of two different groups on campus into a single central IT office, and it got a shiny new website using cutting-edge technology called Drupal 6, built by the guy who was before the guy who was before me in my position. And in terms of ownership, content ownership, that was covered by OIT's Information and News Services team. That's our communications team. And I really want to emphasize how big of a job our INS team has, because OIT, as the central IT office, touches every facet of campus life in some way or another. Right now, we're in the middle of a big rollout for two-factor authentication. All staff are going to have to two-factor in when they log in. That's us. That's a message we have to communicate out to campus. It's also a message we have to communicate when something changes with web hosting services. It's a message we have to communicate when the telephones aren't working. Why aren't they working? Well, we'll get that message out somehow that doesn't involve telephones. So the INS staff have this massive task ahead of them. How do we communicate out to campus? And then came some budget cuts. And over the course of a few years, our INS staff was reduced to one full-time employee. And Rhonda's great. We like Rhonda a lot, but it is a massive task that is too big for one person. And so we find ways to help her out. There are other people who help out. There's a part-time technical writer named Charles, who's great. There are other people, there are student employees that Rhonda trains and helps out with them. But it's still a huge task for one person to handle. And so with that limited capacity, a decision was made. And again, this is all in the distant past. I don't know how this decision was made. All full-time OIT staff, all 300 or so OIT staff, would have editing permissions in that Drupal 6 website. Everybody would have roughly equal permissions to go into any page and change any content they wanted whenever they wanted. And so this question of ownership goes from a small group that is the owner of the OIT website making decisions about content to a 300-person collaborative effort. Raise your hand if you think that plan turns out well. All right, we got one person who thinks that turns out well. So, spoiler alert, things fall apart. So, that was a terrible plan. That was, in principle, it seemed like it was a good idea because we're all IT staff, we're all technically oriented, we should be able to figure out how to run a website. But we ran into this problem. If everyone owns the website, then no one owns the website. And here's what happened. First, we ballooned up to over 2,500 pages. OIT does a lot of things. We do not do enough things to justify over 2,500 pages. We had out-of-date and duplicated and inconsistent content, which we're going to talk about in a minute. Orphan pages, so pages that could not be reached by any other links anywhere else on the website. So many accessibility issues. And then just things that didn't make any sense. And I'm going to give you some examples that capture all of these things all in one. This is a page from the old website. It's about a project that concluded in 2010, the Student Email Initiative. And, excuse me, that was part of NC State's effort to become a Google campus. All of our students, faculty, and staff have Gmail accounts. And so this page talked about what happened back when that project was happening. That's at oit.nccu.edu/student email initiative. If you went to student email initiative/test, you got this page. And if you can't read that, that says this is a test. If you went to test-0, you got this page, this beautiful table-based layout with a broken image that's been broken at least since 2011, with one version of how they were thinking about how they wanted to present the information to students when the project was active, when it was ongoing. And then if you go to test-1, here's another version, which is a slightly different version of how we're going to present that information. So what was happening is whoever was working on this project, and I know who was working on this project, whoever was working, and I'm shaming them only because I think they understand that they were wrong and they're okay with this. Whoever was working on this project was trying to figure out how they wanted to communicate this, and so they made a couple of different versions. They were showing it to other people who were working on it, and then they never went up and cleaned up after themselves. And that's fine, except that it's not fine. All 4 of these pages, which were all about the same thing in some capacity or another, were live published pages that anybody could stumble onto. And one of them made sense. The other 3 didn't. Here's my favorite page, though, in the OIT website. It was completely blank. And if you can't read this, all it said was delete me. And I remember finding this page while I was working on this project and thinking our website was crying out for help. So we had this problem that had ballooned out of control. We had a communication staff that wasn't really, it just didn't have the capacity to handle it. And so we had nobody who had the time or energy or desire to deal with this. And you think that sounds bad, but wait till it gets worse. The rest of OIT starts going rogue. Because we had this terrible OIT website, right? And we also had a lot of IT staff with access to web servers and basic knowledge of HTML, basic knowledge of how to set up Joomla or WordPress or Drupal or whatever else they might want to do. And so we started having teams within OIT start building their own websites. And there was no consistency about domain names. There was no consistency about who was going to be responsible for these things. And because owning and maintaining a website and its content is actually kind of hard work, a lot of those extra websites also found themselves abandoned after a few months or a year or 2 years or something like that. And so we found ourselves in this situation by July of 2015 where for certain OIT services, sort of the worst case for OIT services, you had out-of-date content on the OIT website. You had duplicated content on the OIT website that was also out of date but said something different than the out-of-date content that we started with. And then we had these separate websites that were over here that also talked about that service and also contradicted everything that was on the OIT website. So if you were somebody on campus and you needed to find out information about one of the services that we offered, your best option was to probably pick up the phone and call somebody. And that is a bad look for the central IT office on campus. That is not so great. So just to recap all of that, we had lots of problems, 0 website owners, and 300 content creators who were reluctant to be content creators. They were reluctant to put in the time and energy that it takes because it's not part of their job, because they have other things that they're doing, and this sort of just landed on them. Now you're responsible for content. So something has to be done, and I had been hired, and I'm a sucker. So step 1 was to move oit.nccu.edu into WordPress. And we did that for a lot of reasons, not least of which was because our Drupal guy left and I got hired, and I know WordPress, and the other people I was working with know WordPress, and campus was moving in that direction anyway. Moving into WordPress was a great opportunity to do some cleaning. So we took that 2,500 pages and managed to cull that down into about 700. 700 is still probably too many, but you know, it's progress. We revamped the information architecture into something that I think kind of makes a little more sense, hopefully. And we made it a little more modern. It's mobile friendly. now it matches the new university brand, and by new university brand, I mean it's a couple of years old, but we were lagging behind a little bit. And now it's a more livable, more usable website. Step 2 of that was to then take all of these rogue websites and start consolidating them into a multi-site, because that, the genie's out of the bottle. They've got their websites out there, and people know that domain name. It's been distributed, but the least we can do is to have some consistency across all OIT properties. So we have some consistent branding, some network-wide search tools, so that if you're on one OIT website and you're looking for something that's on another one, if you type into the search bar, it'll at least come up. A workflow for creating new sites so that it just doesn't keep happening. And then some custom plugins that we've built for OIT that are just tools that are available to everybody now. So for instance, all OIT websites have available to them a little widget that we created that interfaces with the system that we use for announcing when a system's down. So when the phones are down, every OIT website, if they want to display that information, can display that information. And then step 3 was to give all full-time OIT staff content creation and editing privileges in WordPress. And you're probably wondering why we did that, because I just spent the first half or so, well, a little bit of the presentation talking about how that was a terrible idea and it caused all of these problems. And it's not because we didn't know what we were doing, it's because that was the option that we had. Out of all of these reasons for unhappiness with the OIT website, a lot of these could be addressed in some form or another by the switch to WordPress and then us doing something to the content as we moved it in. We fixed a lot of problems. But this top row, out-of-date content, bad content, and this question of who's responsible for the content moving forward, those aren't things that can be solved with switching to WordPress, and those aren't some things that can be solved with a one-time, let's just clean everything up. Those are ongoing problems, and they'll continue to get worse. So we came up with a plan, and our plan was to propose a new position called the multi-site administrator. And that administrator would handle all of the network administration tasks that go into running a multi-site, would coordinate with all the people in OIT that know stuff about their service area, and coordinate also with Rhonda, our communications person, to make sure that everything is on board and a nice cohesive message. As needed for people who don't want to create the content, this is somebody who could actually go in and do that, create the content for them. And ultimately, this is the person whose name would be on the service, the person who would be responsible, who would be the owner of the OIT website. And our management said no, because the money just wasn't there. And this is something that happens in higher ed too. And I love working in higher ed, but this is a little frustrating. Sometimes the money's not there, sometimes the answer is no. And so at this point, there was a piece of me that really just wanted to walk away and never look back. But instead, we decided to find a way to make this work. So my first attempt to make it work was a unit-wide email to everybody in the OIT that explained the changes that had been made, that explained how to log into the website, that invited them to come to training sessions, that talked a little bit about the documentation that we had created, things like that. And I thought I had solved it, because everybody is working in good faith toward a common goal. Everybody is going to recognize, yes, it is worthwhile to have up-to-date and accurate content on our website. I am done. I have written the best email ever written. So raise your hand if you think this plan turns out well. All right, no takers this time. This is very wise. I may have tipped you off a little bit with the way I was talking, but you're all very wise. So, as you might expect, the attendance was low at my training sessions. And the reason why is because nobody in OIT actually wants to be a content creator, because they have other jobs. This is not their job. They want to create content. And we saw that with our ballooning 2,500 pages in the old site, but they don't really want to do the hard work that goes into it afterwards. And I don't blame them, because I don't want to do that hard work either. Because what was my answer in July of 2015? My answer was, I'm not the owner of the OIT website. And the problem is that by January of 2016, everybody else did have an answer. And their answer was, I was the owner of the OIT website. And, you know, I say that with some frustration. And I did fight against this idea for a very long time, but they weren't wrong. And they weren't wrong because I had it stuck in my head that there needed to be an owner. And that's because that's how we interact with the other groups on campus that we interact with. There's our point of contact, who's the person that decides what's going to happen on their website, and they coordinate with their staff and figure out what happens after that. So everything I was doing was sort of built around this idea that somebody has to make decisions, somebody has to enforce minimum standards, and as soon as people started to see that somebody was interested in enforcing minimum standards and making decisions, well, that was me now, because I had expressed that desire. So what I really needed to do was find a way to disentangle myself a little bit, trust the people in OIT to make the system work beyond just writing a big email to them and saying, this is how it's going to work. I had to actually give them the tools to empower them to make it work. So what we came up with was this idea of our distributed governance plan, where our group owns the service of the OIT website and the OIT multisite. And owning the service of this multisite means that we maintain WordPress and we do custom development and handle feature requests and provide training and support as requested and enforce governance rules. But we still do not touch the content. That is still not our area. That is the responsibility of everybody else. Everybody else in OIT, and including us for the things that we're responsible for, decide when the content is out of date. They decide to update the content. They decide to create new content, and they ensure the accuracy of the content. And you might be thinking, that is exactly what you had in Drupal, and it turned out terribly. And you're right. We added this extra layer, web content liaisons, who are people we identified in each OIT department who sort of get some extra training, and they've been told by their bosses, you're the person who has to make sure that our stuff is at least sort of okay. They answer basic support questions for other people who are maintaining content, and then they escalate things up to us when they need to. And we started holding training sessions for the web content liaisons, and that didn't exactly go smoothly either, because again, these people just had this thing thrust on them. It's not part of their job description. They're busy, and there's still a couple of departments in OIT that I've never heard from. So we needed to find some other way of making this work, and I'll get to that in a second. But first, we needed to write this governance plan. And I had never written a web governance document before, because that's not my job. I'm barely competent at what I do, which is write bad procedural PHP and run away when JavaScript happens. So I had to get help from somebody who had written a web governance document. And so this is the part where I plug the WPCampus podcast. I am, in my free time, the host of the WPCampus podcast. And I think Rachel thinks I do it because I care about the community and I care about higher ed and WordPress and stuff like that. The reason I actually do it is because I have an opportunity, I have a good excuse to talk to people who are solving my problems somewhere else and find out how they did it. So if you're ever curious, like, what is Brian up to? Just listen to the latest episode of the WPCampus podcast, and there's at least a 50-50 chance that I'm doing something related to that, and I wanted to know how they figured it out. So in episode 10 of the WPCampus podcast, I spoke with Shelley Keith. She was at the University of Mary Washington. Now she is, I think, working for Modern Tribe. You can listen to it. It's a great conversation. Shelley is wonderful. And so the reason I spoke to her is because at last year's WPCampus conference, she had a session about web governance, a university-wide web governance plan at Mary Washington, and I did not attend that session. I regretted it. I wanted to learn what she was telling people, and so I said, hey, do you want to be on the podcast? And Shelley had this idea that I really loved of creating a Bill of Rights for your governance document. This idea that you don't want to have rules that are coming from on high and saying this has to be this and this has to be this. You have to have motivation for people to buy into the idea that it's about your users, and your users have rights. And so the rights of our users that we put together, I think things that everybody can get on board with: up-to-date and accurate information, accessible web content, and just a positive user experience. We also added in the rights of our OIT content creators. So everybody in OIT has rights under our governance document, and those rights include access to our comprehensive documentation, support from us when they need support from us, And then access to data when there's some sort of data that can help them make a content decision, like, is this page worth keeping? Nobody's visited it in 6 years. Things like that. Or alternatively, this page is the most visited page in the OIT website, maybe we should make it look a little better. That's another thing that's going on right now. So we came up with this governance plan, and we got support from it. I didn't really talk to my director about what I was doing when I was writing that document. I just sort of wrote a first draft and then shared it with our communications staff, and people liked it. And eventually the CIO saw it, and the CIO was like, yeah, sure, this is great. And so all of a sudden I was empowered to make rules and figure out how we were going to make those rules work under this governance plan. And so we decided, what are our minimum standards for the OIT website to make a good website? And here are the standards we came up with. All pages in an OIT website must have a title. That's a pretty low bar to start with, but but there were some pages that didn't have titles, and that's frustrating. Every page also has to have somebody who's responsible for it, somebody who is going to keep an eye on it and make sure that the content stays up to date. And they have to do that. They have to review that content at least once a year. You know, we can decide when in the year you want to do that, if it's right before new student orientation, or if it's, you know, over the Christmas break in the school schedule or something like that. That's entirely up to you, but it has to happen at least once every calendar year. And then any new content and any old content has to fit into the overall information architecture. And that way we solve this issue of orphaned pages that were just created and floated out here and nobody ever knew that they existed. And so in practice, the way we do that is every page has to have an assigned parent page in WordPress, except for our top level pages that we created. And then we have a widget that creates a menu based on that parent-child relationship. So we've got all these rules, and I can make all the rules that I want, and I have lots of other rules I would like to make, but we need some way of actually enforcing those rules. And so that's where the WPCampus community saves me again. Stephanie Leary wrote a plugin called the Content Audit plugin. Content Audit is a fantastic tool for me because it lets me actually say who's responsible for the content. So what we did is we created dummy users in WordPress for all of our assignment groups in our call tracking system. So like there's an OIT web services group that I'm a part of, and there's OIT email for the email people and things like that. And then we used the content audit plugin, which creates custom fields for the content owner and the expiration date, these two things that I needed, somebody who's responsible for it, and some sort of schedule on which everything is reviewed and updated. And then when an expiration date is reached, so if the expiration date is July 14th, then that plugin generates an email, and we sort of have a sort of helper plugin connected to this that lets us tweak the email for more specific to our purposes. That plugin generates an email that goes into our call tracking system to that assignment group, and our call tracking system is really great at never letting you forget that you have something that needs to be done. It will just keep reminding you and keep reminding you. And so we use that sort of nagware to our advantage. Once that notification is in their assignment group, they're just going to keep getting bothered until somebody actually goes in, reviews it, and sets a new expiration date for the next time they're going to review it. The one thing that this doesn't do is actually enforce these rules for us. Content ownership and expiration dates under the Content Audit plugin is entirely voluntary. So we needed to come up with our own way of enforcing our rules. And so here we created a helper plugin, the Content Helper plugin. We do all of our development in sort of a closed GitHub Enterprise installation. I put this plugin and another one that I'll talk about in a minute in public GitHub repos so that you can all see my terrible, terrible, terrible code. I didn't go to Ashley's talk about how you really do belong, so I can still say I don't belong. I have no idea what I'm doing. But so you can go and see how this works, but I'm going to go through a couple of examples of how it all works real quick. So In a big picture, the way it works is when you click publish, it runs a series of tests on the page metadata. So the title, content owner field, the expiration field, things like that. Checks it against our content rules. If the page passes, that's great, the page is published. If the page fails, then the page is saved as a draft and an admin notice is posted for the user saying, hey, you failed this rule, your page has been saved as a draft and you need to do something about this until and until you do, then this page is going to continue to be saved as a draft. It will never be published. Administrators have a way of overriding this because I don't want to have to follow my own rules. But for the vast majority of our users, now we have something that actually makes it so they have to have a title and other things too. So we have an options page that has all of our different rules. These are just 4 of them, and different settings that you can set for them. This way we have some flexibility across all of our multi-site. Some sites maybe are going to have slightly different rules than others, depending on special cases. So for instance, a slug of less than 5 words, when IT staff do put titles on pages, they like to have really specific titles, and that can lead to some very long URLs. And so on some of our newer sites, where I'm going to start enforcing this as an error, which means it won't publish. If you have longer than 5 words in your slug, you have to shorten that. I'm not going to do that on the main OIT website because I don't want people changing all their URLs without telling me, and then everything's going to break and it'll be a nightmare. So we have this flexibility for what rules we want to turn on different sites and at what level we want to turn them on. So I said that failed rules, when they're detected, so they're going to display either a warning or an error. A warning means you're just told you did this wrong. An error means you did this wrong and you actually have to fix it. We won't let you publish. There's a little snippet of JavaScript that shows you how we're doing that. So we're testing the content rules using JavaScript. That populates a custom field that we're saving, and then we're using the custom field to we're using the custom field to decide whether or not to display the admin notice, which is something that looks like this. So our admin notice just says, you have to give this a title. Until then, it's going to be saved as a draft. Click here to learn more about page titles. And we have notices like this for each and every rule that we're enforcing. And then if it's an error state, like I said, the page will be saved as a draft. So here's a little screenshot. It says it's in draft state. You can push that publish button as many times as you want. That state is not going to change. And the way we do that is just adding a filter to the save post. This is really, I was surprised by how easy this was to do. There's a little extra step you have to do to make sure that you don't get this page has been published as your little message after you push that submit button, but that's not a problem either. So we have this flag, prevent publish. If prevent publish is true, then just every time it goes to update the information about this post, it's going to be a draft. It's always going to be a draft. So now we come back to all these reasons we were unhappy, and we've started to address some of them. This out-of-date content is never going to be a problem again, I hope, because now every page has to be looked at least once a year. And this who's responsible is never going to be a problem again, I hope, because now every single page has to have a content owner, and you're not going to be allowed to publish if it doesn't. But we still have this issue of bad content. And bad content is hard to deal with because bad content can come in a lot of different forms. I don't know of a good way to decide if something is just flat out not needed anymore, or maybe was never needed. There's no way for me to determine that programmatically, and there's also no way for me to determine that because I don't know how most of the services that OIT does work. I really have no idea what we do. I know my little narrow piece, but we do so much more than that. And then there are these other things too. Content can just be poorly written. Content can be off-brand because our brand guidelines do include these voice and tone guidelines that are really sort of subtle. And you know, IT people, I consider myself an IT person. I love the people I work with. We are not always amazing communicators. And so these subtle ideas about voice and tone sometimes do not make it into our writing. But this question of accessibility, IT people who learned HTML in 1999 and really love their tables can introduce a lot of accessibility issues into a page in WordPress. And I wonder, is there something I can do about that? And it turns out the answer is yes. With another plugin that we built, the NC State Accessibility Helper. Same thing goes as the other one. It's on GitHub. I posted it this morning, so you're not going to see any commit history or anything like that. But it's another place where you can see my terrible code. And what this does is when you click that publish button, it will test the content that you've entered into the WordPress visual editor for different accessibility rules. It will generate an annotated preview in a meta box beneath the editor. So a preview of your content that's highlighted everything that you've done wrong according to these accessibility issues. And then it'll give you a link to learning resources that help you figure out how to fix that problem. And that sounds like a lot of work, and I did not do most of that work. Most of that work, oh, sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. All right, so here's the meta box containing the content. And this is pretty simple. All I did is create a meta box and use the content function. It's not quite this simple because targeting the post that's being edited right now, you can't just use the content, or at least I don't think you can. Maybe that's not what I did. I did something slightly different that doesn't fit nicely into a slide, but it's not that complicated. So you're populating a meta box with the content. And then, like I said, I'm not doing most of the work. Most of the work is taken care of by DQ Systems, which is an accessibility consulting firm, and they created this open source project called the Axe Accessibility Engine. It's all in JavaScript. It's been built to avoid false positives, which is great because I don't want people coming to me saying, your WordPress is saying my content is bad, but I know for a fact that it's right. And it's just easy to use from a developer standpoint. It gives you a lot of data. It gives you your descriptions of your issues. It gives you your link to helper documentation on DQ's website. And then also in my plugin, I have a way that I can override that link if I want to. And so here's our JavaScript snippet right here. I just say my context for Axe to run on is this div that's got the ID annotated content. I run Axe on that context, and I just pull out the information that that Axe gives me, the description, the help, the little help tag, the help URL, the ID for it, and the impact. And I use that, excuse me, to build my annotation. And this is my terrible jQuery JavaScript stuff because, again, I run away when I see JavaScript. But I build and I highlight the issue and I build my annotation. And ultimately what that ends up looking like is something like this. So here we have somebody who changed the color of their text. That text is highlighted in a box. Off to the side, we have floating a little notice that says, hey, you don't have sufficient color contrast, and this link will take you to this documentation about what that even means, why does it matter, and how do you fix it. I also created a few custom tests that I've added in so since Axe is very resistant to false positives, there are certain things that sneak by or certain things that I'm okay telling my users they need to look at even if they've done it right. So an example of that is going to be this. In my plugin, if you have an image, even if your image has alt text, I'm going to give you this little info box that says, hey, just look at your alt text again and make sure that it's really describing the image. Make sure that it's a meaningful description. And then that link goes to one of our pages that talks about what it means for that information, or what it means for that alt text to be meaningful in the context of the page. So our content helper and our accessibility helper don't solve all of our problems, because as anybody who talks about accessibility, and probably anybody who talks about content can tell you, these are things that require human beings to do manual testing to really get them right. But they are helpers that get our staff on the right track. And this gets back to this issue of trust. I need to trust my OIT colleagues to know what they're talking about in their service, to know how to make a good website, because ultimately they do, and I need to trust that they do. What I need to do is just sort of give them that nudge to help them do the right thing where they have some deficiency in their knowledge about accessibility or something like that. So from their point of view, this is how our system works. They get a support ticket in their work group saying they have an out-of-date page. This always happens at least once a year. Somebody in that work group goes to WordPress just to kill the ticket. It goes to WordPress to update that content and update the expiration date. And then after they save changes, if they've introduced any new issues, they'll be notified by our content helper or accessibility helper, and then hopefully they'll fix those issues. They won't just ignore them. So raise your hand if you think this plan is going to turn out well. Yeah, so there are a fair number of people raising their hands, some people who aren't. I'm sort of ambivalent too. I really don't know. So some of these things are very new and very recent and may have only been turned on yesterday in a rush to try to get them done for the presentation, so I wasn't just lying about everything. I've been working on them for a while, and some of them are, there's a lot going on. Yeah, so I don't know if this is going to work. This is this sort of impossible position we've been put in of, by tradition and also by budgetary necessity, everybody in OIT is a part of running our website in some form or another, and I've got to find a way to make it work. This is what I've come up with. So let's talk about why you should care about my nightmare, which is the OIT website, what you should walk away with. So the moral of the story is don't do what we're doing. Except that's not the moral of the story I told you at the beginning. The moral of the story is actually steal good ideas from the WPCampus community and pass them off as your own. Except that's not the moral of the story either, but I do recommend this. This is a great idea. People really liked my governance plan, and most of it just came from Shelley Keith. No, our moral is find ways to trust and empower your content creators. And that's really key because this is something I struggled with for a long time. I was trying to own the website without owning the website. I didn't trust my colleagues to be on my side, and I antagonized some people over the course of it. And now moving forward, as we try to trust and empower our content creators, I really think this ethos is what will get us to the right place in the end. There's still a long way to go on the OIT website. There's still some issues that I introduced in the theme the last time it was updated, and they're JavaScript issues, so don't look too closely at the OIT website. They're going to be fixed. But little by little, we're just chipping away at our list of things that need to be improved. And this idea of we're all on the same side and we all need to be working together is, I think, what's going to get us there. So even so, you might be thinking, this is not me, I do not have this problem, because I have a lot fewer content creators than Brian does, or my content creators actually want to be doing their job, which, I shouldn't be too hard on OIT because this isn't their job. So you may think this doesn't have a lot to do with me, but when you really pull away all of my story and bring things down to the essence of what I've been talking about, there are lessons here that can be scaled to any organization. Because if you have a content team of greater than one, you're going to have issues at some level of coordinating and training your content creators. You're going to have issues of maintaining quality standards, and you're going to have this challenge of keeping things accurate and up to date. Universities and colleges have big websites with lots of information, and somehow we have to make it all stay relevant to the people who are reading it. And what I've discovered over the course of my adventure here is that there are solutions that help us get there, help address those challenges that are available to us inside of WordPress, right there in front of people, without having to bring everybody into an in-person training and beat them down into submission with all of your rules. You can use custom fields to store editorial content. You can use admin notices and meta boxes to give your users feedback as they're creating their content. And then in situations that require it, you can put a filter on that save post and just really nudge them toward the thing that you want them to do. So that's my lesson for all of you. Please steal my ideas. I really do encourage people to steal ideas at WPCampus. It is the best thing ever. And also just tell me what else we should be doing. And then also please do fill out the session feedback form. I really appreciate the feedback. Tweet at me if you have great ideas, or talk to me right now. So thank you. He's right over there.
Yeah, so you passed the one. But I mean, these are really great. I'm seeing a lot of common themes. Obviously.
Yeah, so for the live stream people, there's just somebody saying that I should talk to Jeremy Felt about some of the accessibility stuff he's doing. He should talk to me, and Jeremy is right over there. So we're good. Anybody else? All right, well, thanks, everybody. Oh, yes.
Yeah, well, I have a naive question. I mean, in a sense, Wikipedia is a government, distributed government
Mm-hmm.
kind of guidelines, like you're saying, and based on trust, empowerment. So you must be current opinion now. Is that another workable law? Is that really not a workable law?
Yeah, so the question for the live stream was about Wikipedia and how Wikipedia is also this distributed governance model built on trust and empowerment. And I guess what I'd say is the advantage we have that Wikipedia doesn't is at least all of our content creators are ideally professionals getting paid to do their jobs. And also that we do have an audit history for pages. And Wikipedia does too, but we have this audit history for pages, or this revision history rather. So if somebody does decide to start vandalizing or something like that, that person could get fired. And it's not my job to fire them, but I know who their supervisors are. So there's a level of accountability that's not present in Wikipedia. But I do think, I mean, it's a challenging model, and it's not ideal. I think if I had budgetary authority over the university, I would give OIT quite a lot more money to hire more staff to do more things. But you know, we go with the model that works best for the situation we have. Yes.
Kind of semi-related. What do you think about? We use code review for software, and that takes to get some buy-in too. What do you think about content review in the same style as a peer review kind of thing?
Yeah, so that's something that I've toyed around with. Really, the biggest problem is that the person who ought to be doing that review is Rhonda, our communications person. She's doing lots of other things. You know, one thing we could maybe explore someday is hiring more student staff and training them just for the review process, just training them on the things that they should look at, because even if we don't have money to hire full-time employees, there always seems to be money to hire students because students are cheap, relatively speaking. So that's something that I've thought about exploring. It's just, you know, that's a phase 2 or phase 3 or phase 7 sort of project.
Yeah, just another model to think about.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Do you have like a shareable, maybe PDF or something like that as part of your web governance plan, or?
Yeah, I can post that, and I can add a link into the slides. I'll do that. There's a lot that's very specific to NC State, so some parts may not make a lot of sense, but yeah, I don't mind sharing that at all. All right, well, thank you, everybody. I'll be around, and I'll see everybody tomorrow, too.